From Washington, D.C., the swamp itself, this is The Week's Worst with Allen and Vadum.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen, Vice President and Chief Investigative Officer of the Capital Research Center.
And I'm Matthew Vadum, Senior Vice President of Capital Research Center and Editor-in-Chief of BombThrowers.com.
And I'm Scott Walter, President of the Capital Research Center. I'll be moderating this podcast in which we dig through the news for stories that we think are the most outrageous, the most ridiculous, the worst. Today, we're going to discuss President Trump's controversial travel ban, which critics say is actually a Muslim ban. Steve, can you bring us up to speed on this?
Yeah, the background of this, real quickly for our listeners, is that there were originally 7 countries included in an order that would stop the immigration from those countries for 90 days until procedures could be worked out to make sure that the American people are kept safe. It also included it was 120 days, and also included a ban on immigration from of Syrian refugees for an indefinite period of time. And these countries were Iraq, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Libya, and Somalia. These are all terrorist hotspots and had been designated so by the Obama administration. However, critics attacked this procedure as a de facto Muslim ban, which is absurd, but we'll get into that later. And the courts, some left-wing courts, blocked its implementation, so it was revised and sent back. For example, they took out Iraq. They added a number of exceptions to the rule, protected people such as visa holders and so forth, addressed some of the criticisms that there had been. Some of the criticisms were legitimate of the earlier version of the proposal. And it went back through the courts, and then it went to a judge in Honolulu and a judge in Maryland, and they issued orders, or district judges, relatively lower judges in the federal system, and they issued orders now stopping this thing all over again, raising profound questions regarding the power of the judiciary and the ability of left-wing judges to interfere with the American democratic process. So that's where we are right now.
Thanks, Steve. Trump's been accused of not respecting the role of the judiciary in our system of checks and balances. Why shouldn't he just follow the judge's decision?
Well, there's a long tradition in this country, goes back to the beginning of presidents and other politicians and members of Congress getting into spats with judges, and there should be, because that's all part of the process that we have in our country under the Constitution. We have 3 co-equal branches of government. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, and they're perfectly fine in criticizing each other. Now, judges should keep that in the courtroom and in their rulings, but politicians, they're out there with the public, and they're supposed to represent the public, and they should be able to criticize what judges do. Now, and there are even restraints built into the Constitution regarding the jurisdiction of courts and things where one branch of government can sort of check the power of a different branch. They're supposed to be co-equal so that they can balance each other. But part of that is, again, the president should be allowed to criticize judges, and particularly when they do something like they did in this case. The statute is clear. The president has the authority to control who comes into this country.
By the statute, if I could just add a little bit of background there, you're referring to 8 U.S. Code Part 1182, which states, whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or of any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem to be appropriate. That is current federal law.
Right, and for our listeners who've been indoctrinated in some of the current ideas about political terminology, there's nothing derogatory in the term alien. If I were in France, I would be an alien of France, and that's just the terminology for someone who's not a citizen of that country, not in that country on the basis of being either born there or being a naturalized citizen. So yes, the president has pretty much absolute authority. It's something that's akin to the pardon power. We often complain when a president goes out of office and pardons people right at the end, and we wish wish we could do something about it, but the fact is the president, and for good reasons in most cases, the president has an absolute pardon power, and in this case, the president has an absolute authority over who comes into the country and who doesn't, and that's what the judges are now trying to abrogate.
But Matthew, in this case, the judges are saying that they had to rule Trump's ban unconstitutional because it violates the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Why isn't that relevant?
Well, the Establishment Clause doesn't apply to matters of national security or immigration. The Establishment Clause, I don't think, has ever been held by any court to apply to those in those fields of endeavor. The Establishment Clause protects political speech, and it protects, the First Amendment protects political speech. The Establishment Clause has what some inaccurately refer to as it protects the separation of church and state, but it keeps religion at arm's length from the government. And we could go on and have a big discussion about that, but it would probably bore everybody. The thing is, with immigration and with national security, these rulings by courts recently, by the Maryland federal judge and by the Hawaii federal judge, by Judge Robart in Washington State, by there was a federal judge in Brooklyn, New York, the Eastern District of New York, and there was the Ninth Circuit panel that ruled on this. And they mostly, from what I recall, they didn't cite the federal law, 8 U.S. Code 1182, at all. They just said that they took general principles of law that might apply in other situations and said that various people might suffer irreparable harm if the executive order were to go into full effect. And so they granted temporary restraining orders on that basis. But that's not a valid consideration. That's not a valid way of doing it when you're looking at national security or immigration-related matters, where the president has long been recognized by the courts as being a state actor who is entitled to great deference from the judicial branch. He can't do everything he wants to do by means of executive orders. I think that was what we found in the Truman administration, the steel seizure cases, where President Truman, correct me if I'm wrong on this, Counselor Steve, seized steel foundries because he didn't want the production for the war effort in the Korean War to be interrupted. And that was considered to be so crazy, so absurd and outrageous that the Supreme Court, ruled that he couldn't do that. But that's about the only example I can think of where they've done that sort of thing. You don't want judges sitting around second-guessing the commander-in-chief who was elected by all of the American people to protect the nation. You don't want, Justice Elena Kagan sitting there on the USS Ronald Reagan, deciding whether it is appropriate to launch an airstrike against an Iranian vessel that's threatening United States interests in the Strait of Hormuz, for example. So it's just a lot of people don't understand how this works, especially people on the left. They think that the Constitution protects all that is good. If it does what they want it to do, then a law is constitutional. In other words, they think the Constitution is an instrument for being nice to people instead of a restraint on the powers of the government.
Steve, let me ask us a different religious question involved in this controversy. During the Cold War, the United States set visas aside especially for Soviet Jews escaping religious persecution. Why isn't that an argument for allowing Muslim refugees in today?
Well, We actually have the opposite situation because what's happened is the Obama administration set up a policy regarding the Syrian refugees. Now remember, this is the Syrian refugees who are refugees largely because of the policy of President Obama and his then Secretary of State during much of this time, which was Hillary Clinton.
News reports never mention that.
Yeah, I
strangely
know.
enough.
And so you have the largest refugee crisis, it really is, since World War II. Right now, there are more refugees in the world than there have been in that entire period, or that covers my entire life, for example. So that's the mess that the Obama-Clinton foreign policy got us into. So I understand some thought on the part of people on the left that, well, we're responsible for this by, we meaning they, but that this country is responsible because our president did it and his Secretary of State did it, and they encouraged the rebellion in Syria and then didn't support the people who were the good rebels. And what happened was they got wiped out, and that left the bad rebels, who were people basically ISIS is who we're talking about here. And then they established an enclave. They established the Islamic State, and they were able to do this. So now you have all these people, these pictures of these children who are fleeing from the horror in Syria, and you see, the bloody pictures as they're referred to. But in fact, what you go back and find is that in 2011, when the war started in Syria, the Obama administration did hardly anything. They only took in a handful of refugees. I think it was in like double digits. And then the same was true for the next year, and then finally in around 2015 they started taking in a few thousand. I think it was less than 2,000, and then suddenly ratcheted it up right at the end. So this would be the responsibility of the next president for the ramifications of all that. Now, what happened was Syria was about 10% Christian when all this started. There were also a substantial number of Yazidis, which is a persecuted religious group. And yet the refugees that were admitted to the United States were, I think, the first batch, it was like 1.5% or 1% Christian. It's now under 1/2%. So instead of 10%, it's 1/2%. And the Yazidis, the first group, there was one part of the first few thousand, there was one Yazidi, one, not 1%, one. And so they were literally admitting only the people who were not the ones who were being subject to genocide. And the reference is made sometimes to the case of the SS St. Louis. That was the ship of Jewish refugees that tried to get to escape from Hitler, and they were denied entry in the United States. And this is considered one of the great humanitarian disasters, crimes almost of people who lived in that time period, who were the government officials, that they didn't give the Jews a chance to escape from Hitler. Well, of course, that was based on the idea that if you're a Jew and you're trying to escape from Hitler, maybe you should be given top priority, or maybe you and there were some other groups that were horribly persecuted by Hitler, but certainly Jews would be pretty close to the top of that list. And yet this judge is ruling in the opposite direction. And of course, you're absolutely right. During the Cold War, Jews were persecuted in the Soviet Union. They were given priority, and no one ever raised the argument that somehow this is a violation of the First Amendment. And let me just comment on what Matthew said earlier. There are two areas of the First Amendment that have to do with religious freedom. One is that you have freedom of religion yourself, and the other is that the government can't establish a religion. The reference would be to the official church in England. That's what they were trying to get away from, the idea that you have an Anglican church that's the official government church. So the First Amendment is supposed to prevent that. Now, the first part that I mentioned doesn't apply to people coming into the country, because only people who are either in the United States or citizens of the United States have the constitutional rights. Otherwise, we would be forced to intervene in countries around the world to protect the rights of all those other people, which I would love to do if only we could do that without blowing up the world and creating disasters, as we've seen from recent years when we stick our nose into places that we shouldn't be. So that one doesn't apply. The other is, are you establishing a religion? And there's a three-pronged test that's usually used. It's called the Lemon test. And one is whether the action that the government official wants to take has a primarily secular purpose, one that's not primarily religious. And then the second is, does it have the principal effect of advancing a particular religion? And then the third is, does it entangle the government with religion? Well, I don't think, Donald Trump has put on his cap as a member of, some bishopric somewhere. I don't think he's suddenly a religious figure who's trying to entangle the government with his religion. I don't think most people could tell you specifically what. I guess they could say, I guess he's a Christian, but that's about as much as most people could say about Donald Trump as far as his religion. He's not an especially religious guy, so that certainly is not that it doesn't meet that test. And then you have, does it have the effect of inhibiting religion? I don't think keeping out a few refugees or keeping out a few people from countries that happen to be majority Muslim is going to have a significant effect on turning this country into a non-Christian country. So that one doesn't. And then that test doesn't apply. And then the other part is, does it have a primarily secular purpose? And clearly, we're using the list, the original list before Iraq was taken off as part of after the criticism. The original list was terrorist hotspots. If you go down the list of countries that are the top Muslim countries, either by population or by percentage, you can't pick out these countries. That is to say, they're sort of randomly distributed on the list. There are 47 countries that are majority Muslim. There are 57 that are members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the sort of the club of Islamic countries. And if you didn't know in advance which countries had been picked, you wouldn't be able to look at this and say, oh, well, that's a Muslim ban. It's not a Muslim ban. That's the thing that the critics say that they just can't back up. There's just no evidence for that, and yet they keep doing it. It's basically fake news. It's something you see on news websites and headlines in newspapers, the lead on the Today Show and other morning shows, and they'll have the graphic on the screen and say it's a Muslim ban, but it ain't.
Well, Matthew, moving past the legal issues, why is this travel ban good policy? One obvious criticism people make is that there have been 9 fatal attacks by Islamist terrorists on U.S. soil since 9/11. And the countries of origin of those attackers, none of them are included in the ban. Those countries would be Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, Egypt, Kuwait, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia.
Well, one of the problems is that, and I'm not going to dwell on this, is that the courts that have been putting stays on the executive orders are not staying within what lawyers call the 4 corners of the document. They're just supposed to look at what the order says. Instead, they're looking beyond it. They're looking at what Rudy Giuliani said on TV. They're looking at comments that President Trump made during the campaign that demonstrate, in the words of, I think it was the Honolulu judge, Derek Kahala Watson, who said that these statements demonstrated a certain animus towards a specific religion, that being Islam. So the question of whether you actually can produce a body count is not relevant legally. Stepping away from that, though, there have been a lot more attacks. I think you just said, Scott, that there were 7 or 8 attacks that led to fatalities in the United States that have been considered Muslim terrorist attacks. I think that the figure of all Muslim terrorist attacks since 9/11 is closer to 80, according to what the Heritage Foundation has been tracking. So these, you can't just judge it based on successful terrorist attacks. You also have to take into account the terrorist attacks that were unsuccessful, that we managed to foil somehow and prevent from happening. And there is a big problem in countries like Syria, where there is not much of a functioning central government. We cannot get records from them in order to vet refugee claimants to see if they're bad people, to see if they're career criminals or associated with terrorist groups, and so on. And a lot of these countries are in the same position. And in addition, terrorist groups like Islamic State, they have been bragging openly that they are planting their people in the refugee claimant stream. So they're saying right there for everyone to hear that their people are coming as refugees to Europe and to the United States. So if you had to establish an actual evidentiary basis to justify the travel ban, the executive order, you have it there. You don't have to show up with a pile of bodies. All you have to show is that there is a threat to U.S. national security. The commander-in-chief, the president, is in a unique position to make that judgment call, having access to all sorts of intelligence reports that the average person doesn't have access to, and that members of the federal judiciary definitely do not have access to. So the president is entitled to protect us from perceived threats. And judges, that's not really their responsibility, and they overstep their authority and become black-robed politicians when they get in President Trump's way on this matter.
Steve, so much of the radical Islamic terrorism in this country has been homegrown. The Pulse nightclub shooter, for instance, he was an American. He was radicalized on our soil. Why should the president put the focus overseas?
Well, because you're trying to keep people from coming in and doing terrible things. It's very difficult to do things in that regard for people who are already here. If someone is in the United States is being radicalized or has been radicalized as part of their religious training, then you try to track that. You try to find out who the radical imams are or others who are leaders of hate organizations, whether they're religious or not. You try to keep track of that. That's what the FBI does. That's what other law enforcement agencies do. But we're talking about international affairs, and we're talking about trying to stop people from coming into the country who are a threat to this country. You can't judge by what's already happened when you're trying to prevent things that are happening in the future. And of course, as Matthew has pointed out, even if you do look at what's already happened, if you look at the attempts, you get a different result from if you look at the few that have been successful. Thank goodness, relatively few that have been successful. The countries that we're talking about, these are not nice places. Every single one of these countries on the list has territory that enforces Sharia law, that includes the execution of homosexuals, that includes the oppression, the subjugation of women, that has very much the sexual mutilation of women. People forget that that's an important part of the subjugation of women. And the people who come from there or have ties there are people that tend to be radicalized, and certainly with regard to you're talking about the refugees. USA Today had a story about a Syrian refugee camp and how there was a fellow in there who was gay, and he knew if he mentioned that fact to anyone, or if somehow someone found out, that his life would probably be over. Because he knew the people who were in that camp with him. That doesn't mean there are not a lot of children. There are not a lot of people who are good people who are trying to flee oppression. But you've got to have a vetting procedure. And you're talking about a part of the country, you don't have records. I mean, we don't have computer records of what these people have been up to. We can't look on their Facebook pages to find out where they are. So you have to have very strict vetting procedures. And you can't allow what's happened in Europe, where people have flooded into Europe. And those attacks often have been people who have been part of refugee populations or have ties to refugee populations that were supporting them in their terrorist activities.
And the whole purpose of President Trump's executive orders, these so-called travel bans, was to have a pause on immigration from certain from terrorism-producing parts of the world, so that this new administration, remember, he was only sworn in, month and a half ago, and it was so that the Trump administration can implement its plan of so-called extreme vetting to make sure that the baddies don't get through the screening process. Something also that's kind of bugged me in the press coverage since the ruling by Judge Watson in Honolulu was that the lawsuit that he was ruling on was brought by an Egyptian-born Muslim cleric named Ismail el-Sheikh. He is an imam to the Muslim Association of Hawaii and has ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly to a fringe radical Muslim group called the North American Imam Federation. So it's fascinating that someone who may very well be plotting with terrorists, or at least part of their inner circle, is the one who brought this lawsuit that so far has been successful, and on which the judge in Honolulu, against which the judge in Honolulu issued a temporary restraining order. So we basically have the Muslim Brotherhood now determining U.S. immigration policy, and I'm not seeing that discussed anywhere. Except maybe on some of the right-leaning news outlets like Breitbart and so on, and Pajamas Media. No one seems to have noticed this, that that cliche, the terrorists have won. Well, yes, they have. They're in control of U.S. immigration policy right now. And it's absurd and outrageous, and nobody seems to be talking about it.
One of the really bad developments on the left has been that they've stopped differentiating between different Muslims. There are 1.2 billion or so Muslims in the world, and there are all sorts of different stripes and formulations of how people see Islam. But there are a lot of people who are really bad, who believe in Sharia law, who are affiliated with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. Probably the majority of mosques in the country are at least in some degree radicalized. Now, whether they call for violence or whether they just have hate against women and homosexuals, or whether they're reformists who believe in democratic values and believe in people being allowed to live their lives. Those are things that are different for different mosques and different factions in the Muslim community. And what the president has at least said he was trying to do, and when they go back and research his campaign statements to try to find things to shoot down his policies, well, they should look at this. He's talked about teaming up with the good guys to beat the bad guys, and how we need to do that we can't beat the bad guys solely on by staying within our own culture and not communicating with people on the other side. And you have places like Jordan, like the government in the current government in Egypt that overthrew the Obama-backed government, where they're willing to help us. Now, they're not perfect. They do a lot of things I don't agree with, but they're certainly better than the people that they would like to work with us to defeat.
Well, Steve, you have a law degree. If you were advising the president at this point, what would your advice be?
Well, one of the problems we have, and this has been pointed out for years, I worked in Newt Gingrich's campaign, and Newt got in trouble for writing an op-ed saying we need to figure out some way to rein in the out-of-control judiciary because they're getting more and more arrogant. They're taking in more power to themselves and trying to basically overthrow the form of government that we have. Megyn Kelly, by the way, attacked him for writing this. And the fact is we have to come up with some way to have a better judicial system. You shouldn't have a couple of district court. I mean, these aren't even like higher court judges. These are district court judges issuing rulings that affect the whole country. And what about all those judges out there who may disagree with them? How did they get to the first of the line? Was this, forum shopping, judge shopping?
And also it's kind of strange that it was a Hawaii judge, federal judge, who did this, and that's part of the Ninth Circuit, which is going to rubber stamp anything any anti-Trump ruling, they can.
Right. The Ninth Circuit, or the Ninth Circus, as moderates and mainstream people on constitutional issues refer to them, they're basically a bunch of nuts, and they get overturned when they get to the Supreme Court. What is it, 80% of the time?
Something like 80%.
Yeah, and so we have to start looking critically at ways to improve the system so that this kind of thing can't happen. Of course, one way would be to get a fifth member of the Supreme Court. If you had a fifth member of the Supreme Court, then you would have it would.
You mean a fifth conservative member?
A fifth conservative member to fill that vacancy, the Scalia vacancy, and then you would it would get the Supreme Court, and you'd have a resolution to this. Now, you may have one anyway. I mean, this is so bad that Alan Dershowitz, who's a famous liberal lawyer, says even with the current Supreme Court, 4-4 between the four radicals and the four relatively mainstream people, that even with that split, you may have one of the people on the left who says, "Oh, come on, we can't do this," and will overturn it. So that's to be hoped for.
But don't bet the farm on it.
Well, Matthew, Steve's talked about judicial avenues for redressing the situation, but longer term, what would you like to see Congress do about this problem?
Well, I think it'd be a great idea, and this is something that Congressman Louis Gohmert, Republican, Texas, a great guy, proposed a couple of days ago. I think it was on the Lou Dobbs show on Fox Business. He said that there should be legislation that removes Article 2 courts or federal courts jurisdiction in matters involving immigration, and that makes actually a lot of sense, because then the courts hearing the cases would just all of a sudden the cases would be mooted. They would lose jurisdiction, and their cases would be over. Certain things should not be reviewable by the courts, and this is one of those things. Congress
and by
also,
the way, that's in the Constitution for anyone who might object and say, "Oh, you can't do that." It's specifically in the Constitution. That you
right,
can do that.
the Congress determines the jurisdiction of federal courts, and that's beyond dispute. Something else that it could do is Congress could declare the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization, because it does have its tentacles in the U.S. government. You had those three information technologists on Capitol Hill recently. I think they worked for the House of Representatives, who were outed as leaking information and getting access to sensitive documents, which they could have passed on to the Islamic terrorist underworld. These were three young Muslim men, computer nerds, and that's very dangerous. So that would be a good thing to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. That would definitely help with the fight here at home against Islamic terror.
Okay, well, that's our show this week, folks. We'll be back next week, and we hope you'll join us. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes and Stitcher, and follow us on social media. For Facebook and YouTube, you can find us at Capitol Research Center, and on Twitter, our handle is @CapitolResearch.
I'm Dr. Stephen J. Allen.
And I'm Matthew Vadum.
And I'm Scott Walter. Thanks for listening.